I was just painting her fence. When she whispered she missed being touched. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind where sunlight spills lazily across a neighborhood, painting everything it touches in warm gold. I hadn't planned to spend my day working, much less helping someone with a fence, but when she asked if I could lend a hand, I didn't hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I simply wanted the excuse to be near her. She opened the gate before I even knocked, her presence immediately grounding. There was an ease to her confidence, a natural elegance in the way she moved, even in casual clothes. She was in her early 40s, but carried herself with the effortless grace of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything. Her smile was gentle, welcoming, with a hint of mischief, and her eyes, bright, observant, and a little lonely, met mine with a warmth that made me feel simultaneously nervous and at home. The backyard was a small haven. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and flowers, mingling with the sharp, comforting scent of fresh wood. Birds chirped in the trees, and a soft breeze stirred the leaves above, making shadows dance on the fence we were about to paint. I unpacked the supplies: cans of paint, brushes, and a well-worn tarp to protect the grass. She offered a casual laugh at my overly careful setup, and I caught the way the corners of her eyes crinkled, subtle but magnetic. As we started, our movements inevitably brushed against one another. She handed me a paintbrush, our fingers brushing in a fleeting touch that lingered far longer than it should have. I felt my pulse quicken, not from the work, but from her nearness, from the quiet electricity of proximity. It was strange. I barely knew her, yet every subtle movement, every glance felt loaded with unspoken possibility. She moved with careful precision along the fence, occasionally pausing to examine her work, and I found myself studying the small details about her. The way sunlight caught in her hair, the soft sigh she let out when a stroke didn't go perfectly, the faint warmth of her skin as I handed her a cloth to wipe the brush. There was a gentle rhythm to our work, a silent dance of shared space, punctuated by small smiles, brief laughter, and the occasional word of encouragement. At one point, she paused and leaned against the fence, arms crossed casually, watching me carefully with that quiet, assessing gaze that felt almost intimate. I felt a strange mix of admiration and nerves. She wasn't flirting, at least not in any obvious way, but there was a subtle invitation in the way she lingered, a hint that she was comfortable, maybe even wanting my presence more than I expected. By the time we'd finished a couple of panels, I realized this wasn't just about painting a fence. It was about proximity, the slow unfolding of awareness, the sense of being seen in ways that went beyond simple neighborly kindness. And somewhere between the scent of paint, the warmth of sunlight, and the softness of her glance, I felt the first stirrings of something I couldn't name but knew would grow, an attraction tempered with respect, curiosity, and quiet tension. It was a simple Saturday afternoon, but by the time I left that first hour behind, I knew this encounter was different. Something unspoken had shifted in the air between us. Small, almost invisible gestures that hinted at emotional intimacy waiting to bloom. And though neither of us said it aloud yet, I could sense the beginning of a connection that would be hard to ignore. By mid-afternoon, the backyard had transformed into a tapestry of color and shadow. Half the fence was freshly painted, the wood gleaming warmly under the golden sunlight. The rhythm of work had settled into a comfortable, almost meditative pattern, broken only by the occasional spill or errant brushstroke. It was during one of these small mishaps that the first real spark of connection flared. A glob of paint slipped from the brush, landing with an unceremonious splat on the grass, and a little on her hand. She gasped, laughing softly at her own clumsiness, and I stepped forward instinctively, offering a damp cloth to wipe it away. Our hands met briefly in the exchange, fingers brushing lightly, a contact so fleeting it could have been accidental, but the warmth of it lingered, leaving a subtle tension humming between us. We laughed together, the sound blending with the soft rustle of leaves and distant children playing down the street. It was easy, natural, and for a moment it felt like time had slowed. I noticed the way she tilted her head when she smiled, a small quirk that made her look both approachable and quietly alluring. Her eyes held a glimmer of amusement, but there was also something more, a vulnerability beneath her confidence, a trace of the loneliness she hadn't yet voiced. As we resumed painting, our interactions grew more relaxed. She handed me the roller with a careful smile, and again, our hands brushed. I lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, aware of the warmth and softness of her skin. She didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed to accept it with a quiet ease, a small acknowledgement that she appreciated the closeness. There was something unspoken in these tiny gestures, a silent conversation unfolding between glances and fleeting touches. The work itself became secondary to the intimacy forming around it. I caught myself stealing glances at her, noticing the way sunlight played along her collarbone, how a stray strand of hair fell across her face, and the delicate curve of her smile when she caught me staring. Every small movement she made seemed charged with subtle significance, and I realized I was no longer just helping with a fence. I was witnessing her, really seeing her, in a way that made my chest tighten and my thoughts linger. We paused again for a break, sitting on the grass with paint-stained hands, sharing a bottle of water. Her fingers brushed mine as she passed it, and I felt a spark of warmth that wasn't entirely from the sun. She laughed softly at something I said, a gentle melodic sound that made the world outside the backyard fade into irrelevance. There was no rush, no pressure, just the simple, delicious tension of two people close enough to feel each other's presence, yet still holding back the deeper reach of touch. By the time the sun began to tilt toward late afternoon, there was a quiet understanding between us. The day had shifted from a simple task into something richer, more intimate. Every laugh, every accidental touch, every shared glance built a fragile bridge of trust and attraction. And though neither of us said it aloud, the space between us was charged with possibility. A subtle, simmering connection that promised to deepen with time. The afternoon had softened into a gentle, warm glow, and we had moved from the fence to the porch for a short break. The air carried a faint mix of freshly painted wood and the subtle sweetness of garden flowers. A soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and for a moment, the backyard felt like an entirely separate world. Quiet, private, suspended in time. We sat side by side on the worn wooden steps, our shoulders almost brushing. I handed her a bottle of water, and as our fingers touched, there was a small pause, long enough for me to feel a flutter of warmth, and for her to glance at me with a delicate, almost shy smile. It was the first time the stillness between us felt heavy with more than casual comfort. She spoke first, her voice low and unguarded. "You know," she said, tracing a finger absent-mindedly along the edge of the step, "I miss being touched, not in any complicated way, just simple human touch." Her words hung in the air, soft but powerful, and I felt my heart tighten. There was no hint of flirtation in her tone, just honesty, vulnerability, and the quiet ache of a longing that had been kept private for too long. I swallowed, unsure whether to respond immediately, aware that any reaction could shift the fragile intimacy building between us. Instead, I simply nodded, offering a reassuring smile, letting her know that her words were heard and accepted. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged, meaningful. I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze briefly dropped to her lap before returning to meet mine. There was a subtle courage in admitting such a simple human need, and I felt a mix of admiration, empathy, and a growing, unspoken attraction. As I reached for my own water bottle, our hands brushed again. This time, the touch lingered a fraction longer, and she didn't pull away. My pulse quickened at the intimacy of the moment, soft, tentative, and deeply human. It was the kind of connection that had nothing to do with urgency or desire in the vulgar sense. It was about recognition, presence, and the warmth of shared understanding. We spoke in whispers then, not about paint or fences, but about life, about little regrets, quiet hopes, and the invisible weight of loneliness that sometimes settled in. I learned about her routines, the small joys she clung to, and the moments of quiet sadness she rarely shared. With every word, every fleeting glance, the distance between us shrank. I could feel her trust settling around us, like a fragile thread connecting two people who hadn't expected to need each other. yet suddenly couldn't ignore the pull. By the time the sun had moved lower in the sky, painting the backyard with soft amber light, I realized this break had shifted everything. The subtle flirtations of hands brushing and stolen glances had transformed into something deeper. Emotional intimacy, honest vulnerability, and a quiet, mutual longing neither of us had voiced fully, but both of us understood. And in that moment, I knew that this wasn't just a casual afternoon of painting a fence. It was the beginning of something far more delicate, far more meaningful. The slow unfolding of a connection that promised to grow, to linger, and to change us both in ways we hadn't yet imagined. Late afternoon had settled fully, and the sun now filtered through the trees in long golden beams. Shadows stretched lazily across the yard, brushing over the freshly painted fence. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint, comforting scent of paint mingled with the earthy aroma of the garden. There was a calmness, a stillness that made everything feel suspended, as if the world had stepped back and left only the two of us. We returned to work, though the energy was different now. It wasn't about finishing the fence. It was about proximity, about sharing space in a way that felt intimate without words. She lingered nearby, handing me brushes and paint cans with a quiet attentiveness that was both practical and personal. Each time our fingers brushed, I felt a brief spark, a pulse of warmth that lingered far longer than it should. I found myself watching the way the sunlight caught her hair, the gentle curve of her shoulders, the softness in her eyes when she glanced at me. We moved in an easy rhythm, side by side, silently acknowledging each other's presence. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, just the subtle closeness of two people existing in the same space and beginning to notice one another in ways that mattered. Every small interaction, a hand passing a brush, a shared laugh at a misstep, a quiet word of encouragement, felt charged with unspoken meaning. At one point, I stepped back to examine a panel I had just finished. She came closer, leaning slightly over my shoulder to look, her hair brushing against my arm. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but the warmth of it spread through me like a quiet current. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled softly, her eyes meeting mine in a glance that lingered longer than polite social convention demanded. That look said more than words ever could. Acknowledgement, trust, and an unspoken curiosity about what might be possible between us. As we continued painting, the world outside the yard seemed to fade. Birds chirped distantly, but it was as if the sounds came from a faraway place, irrelevant to the small universe we were creating together. I became aware of how often I caught myself stealing glances at her, noticing every small movement, the way she tilted her head when considering a brushstroke, the subtle way her lips parted as she concentrated. Each observation was electric in its intimacy, small, careful, respectful. By the time we paused again, I felt a deep, almost magnetic pull toward her presence. There was comfort in it, warmth, and the delicious tension of knowing that our connection was growing in ways neither of us had yet fully acknowledged. She shifted closer as we sat on the edge of the porch, our shoulders nearly touching, the air between us heavy with unspoken words and restrained emotion. Every accidental touch, the brush of her hand, the closeness of our bodies, spoke volumes, each one a step closer to the emotional intimacy simmering just beneath the surface. In that lingering presence, I realized something significant. This was no longer just neighborly help or casual conversation. It was a delicate, emerging connection, a slow, simmering attraction built not on grand gestures, but on quiet, meaningful closeness. And as the golden light deepened around us, I understood that we were both aware of it, silently allowing the tension to build, knowing that the next moments, whenever they came, would carry a weight neither of us could ignore. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, and the backyard was awash in a warm, gentle glow. The fence was almost finished, each panel gleaming with fresh paint, yet it felt as if the real work, the invisible, unspoken tension between us, was just beginning. The day's labor had drawn us closer, not through force or urgency, but through quiet moments of shared presence and subtle gestures that lingered longer than polite conversation should allow. I found myself acutely aware of every small movement she made. The way she leaned to inspect a stroke of paint, the gentle tilt of her head when she smiled, the warmth in her eyes when our gazes met. It all sent a thrill through me I wasn't entirely prepared for. There was a magnetic pull, subtle but undeniable, and yet a voice inside me whispered caution. She was older, experienced, composed. I was younger, inexperienced in navigating the complexity of emotional intimacy with someone so assured and quietly vulnerable. We paused briefly, standing near the corner of the fence. She reached out to pass me the paint tray, our fingers brushing almost imperceptibly, but enough to make my pulse spike. I wanted to linger there, to let my hand rest against hers, to feel the warmth of her touch, but propriety, hesitation, and a deep respect for her boundaries held me back. It was frustrating and thrilling all at once, the way desire and restraint collided in the small space between us. She spoke, her voice low, almost teasing, yet carrying a hint of wistfulness. You know, it's funny how simple touches can feel so rare. I don't think I've felt this kind of closeness in a long time. Her words struck me with an unexpected intensity. She wasn't asking, not overtly. She was merely revealing a truth about herself. And in doing so, she drew me closer, emotionally, in ways I wasn't fully prepared to navigate. I wanted to respond, wanted to say something reassuring, comforting, even vulnerable, but words felt inadequate. Instead, I nodded, met her eyes, and let the silence stretch between us. There was something intimate in that shared pause, something electric in the acknowledgement of her feelings and the unspoken recognition of mine. The world seemed to contract around us. The distant sounds of the neighborhood faded, the breeze softened, and even the faint scent of fresh paint seemed secondary to the closeness we shared. Every accidental brush of hands, every brief contact now carried weight. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Admiration, desire, respect, hesitation. I longed to bridge the distance without overstepping, to show that I cared and that her vulnerability was met with understanding rather than awkwardness. And yet, part of me wanted to pause, to savor this slow, simmering tension, knowing that the beauty of what was developing lay in its delicacy and restraint. As we returned to painting, a quiet rhythm resumed, but it was charged differently now. The emotional stakes had risen. The connection was no longer just playful or casual. It was layered, rich, and quietly intense. Both of us felt it. A magnetic tension that was neither acted upon nor denied, hovering like the golden light around us, promising that the slow burn of desire and understanding was only just beginning. Twilight had fallen, wrapping the backyard in a soft, dusky glow. The fence gleamed faintly in the fading light, its fresh paint reflecting the warm hues of the setting sun. Crickets began their evening chorus, and a gentle breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint, lingering scent of flowers and wood. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant, as if the backyard existed in its own private bubble, a space where time had slowed just for us. We had finished the fence. The hard work was done, and for the first time that afternoon we could pause without the distraction of labor. I leaned against the fence, hands slightly paint-stained, feeling the cool wood beneath my fingers. She joined me, standing close enough that the subtle warmth of her presence brushed against me. The distance between us was minimal, yet charged with anticipation, a quiet tension that had been building all day. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a vulnerability in it that made my chest tighten. Not just for helping, but for being here. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the unspoken meaning behind the words. She wasn't talking about paint or chores. She was talking about presence, trust, connection. I hesitated, aware of the magnetic pull drawing me closer. Every instinct in me wanted to close the small gap between us, to let my hand brush against hers, to reach out and acknowledge this silent desire. But caution tempered my desire. I wanted to move carefully, to ensure she felt comfortable, respected, seen. She shifted slightly, leaning a fraction closer as if sensing my internal struggle. Her hand brushed against my shoulder, a light, deliberate touch that was intimate without being overwhelming. The warmth of her skin, the softness of the gesture, sent a jolt through me. My heart raced, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers brush against hers lightly, tentative but deliberate, meeting her halfway in this shared moment of closeness. We stood like that for several long, suspended seconds. There was no need for words. The silence spoke volumes. Every glance, every heartbeat, every subtle shift in posture conveyed longing, trust, and understanding. The air between us seemed alive, charged with quiet electricity. I noticed the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the softness in her gaze, the way her lips curved into a barely there smile. And in that moment, I realized that the subtle, respectful, shared intimacy was more profound than any overt declaration. Finally, she spoke again, her voice warm, almost shy. I didn't realize how much I needed this. And in that simple admission, the emotional weight of the day settled between us, tangible and undeniable. I felt an irresistible pull, and without thinking, I stepped slightly closer. Our hands met fully this time, fingers intertwining naturally, lingering, not hurriedly, as if time had slowed to accommodate the significance of the moment. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was perfect in its simplicity, a quiet, meaningful touch that spoke of trust, desire, and the promise of connection. For the first time that day, the tension that had been simmering between us found release, not in words, but in the warmth of our presence and the gentle contact that neither of us wanted to end. In that moment, I knew something had shifted irrevocably. This was more than attraction. It was understanding, acceptance, and the first step toward an emotional intimacy neither of us had anticipated, but both had secretly longed for. Night had fallen, and the backyard was bathed in the soft glow of a single porch light. The fence stood freshly painted, each panel gleaming faintly under the moonlight. Crickets chirped softly in the garden, and a gentle evening breeze carried the scent of warm wood mixed with faint flowers. Everything felt hushed, as if the world had paused to give space to the quiet, electric intimacy that had been building between us all day. We sat side by side on the porch steps, close enough that the warmth of her body brushed against mine. The day's labor had left our hands slightly paint-stained, and in a strangely intimate way, those marks felt like evidence of the time we had shared. The small moments of closeness, laughter, and touch that had threaded together to create something far more significant than either of us had anticipated. She turned slightly, looking at me with that same calm, observant gaze that had drawn me in from the start. "I never expected this day," she said softly, her voice warm and sincere. "Not just the help, but everything else." There was a vulnerability in her tone, a quiet honesty that made my chest tighten. I knew exactly what she meant. The subtle glances, the fleeting touches, the slow unfolding of emotional intimacy that had woven its way between us like an invisible thread. I reached out gently, letting my hand brush against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed it, softening into the touch, a small, reassuring warmth that conveyed more than words ever could. We shared a long, quiet glance, and in that moment, the distance that had existed between us, the age difference, the caution, the social boundaries, felt insignificant compared to the connection we had built. "I'm glad you were here," I said, my voice low but steady. "More than I realized I would be." She smiled, and it was soft, unguarded, real. A smile that acknowledged not just the day, but the emotions, the longing, and the trust that had grown between us. For a few moments, we simply sat there, letting the quiet of the night wrap around us. The tension that had been simmering all day had softened into something deeper, an understanding, an emotional intimacy that felt both delicate and profound. I felt her hand shift slightly to rest against mine, a subtle but deliberate gesture that conveyed comfort, closeness, and a mutual acknowledgement of the bond we had forged. Finally, she leaned slightly closer, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was gentle, patient, and entirely natural. I responded by wrapping an arm around her shoulders, feeling the warmth of her body and the steady rhythm of her breathing. In that simple embrace, all the hesitation, doubt, and longing of the day settled into a quiet certainty. We had found something rare and meaningful in each other. We didn't need to speak further. The night, the fence, the garden, and the fading glow of the porch light said it all. Our connection was no longer tentative. It was real, mutual, and fully acknowledged. And as we sat there together, hands intertwined and hearts quietly aligned, I knew this was the beginning of something lasting. A gentle, respectful, age-gap romance built on trust, presence, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of affection. The world could wait. For now, it was just us, and that was enough. If this story made your heart race or reminded you of a quiet, unforgettable connection, hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. More slow burn, age gap romances are coming soon, and you won't want to miss a single moment.